This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh, Revi, and on the gist today, we're looking at the crisis around Ukraine. Our expert analyst joins us from Moscow, Dr. Maxim Suchkov. He's the director of the Institute for International Studies and the Center for Advanced American Studies. He's also an associate professor at the Department of Applied International Analysis at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, that's MGIMO. Dr. Suchkov, good to have you back on StratNews Global. Lots of developments have taken place overnight.
Indeed. Well, thanks for having me. Always a pleasure to be with you in your show.
Your assessment straight away after what has happened in terms of first the National Security Council meeting, President Putin addressing the nation, and then signing that order which recognizes the independence of the Donbass region in those two republics. Your assessment, or did you expect this? I saw on social media you said the only thing that was supposedly expected and has come true is that the move was made after the Olympics.
Well, international affairs experts usually say that throughout decades, not much changes in international relations, which is very much true. But yesterday was one of those days where, on a relatively short span of time, tons of historical events happened. First, the meeting of the Security Council that you mentioned was extremely interesting. Putin claimed it wasn't, scripted, and it wasn't pre-recorded, and it was indeed broadcast live, as he called one, top minister after another, basically asking them to clarify their position in public, which very much created this idea of the quote-unquote collective responsibility for the decisions made in the Russian elite. So just in case, some people are unhappy with that decision or support that decision or have different views on that, Putin now has a clear right to say that it was, asked, not was just, his own whim to make that decision, but a collective decision of the Russian elite. So that was very important. And his speech, I would argue, was extremely important and targeted very much at the domestic audience and very much evolved not so about Russia-West conflict, but was really a speech about Russia's own history, which he sees is very much interlinked with the Ukraine's history as part of the kind of common history. And basically, in his speech, he explained the Russian rationale for the foreign policy of Russia towards Ukraine. Long history of what was wrong with the Soviet decision-making on Ukraine, which is also extremely important because it, very much, I'd say it's the first time he goes openly in public, so critical about early days of the Soviet decision-making on Ukraine, very much questioning, Lenin policy on Ukraine formation. So that is a very important aspect of how he really takes sides in this kind of Russia's internal debate of, on the Soviet legacy. And in a way goes counter to the Western narrative that he's very much seeking to restore the Soviet Union, because, that yesterday he offered criticism to that. Another important layer of that was, I think, he seeing himself acting in that crisis not as a political figure, not as a politician, but more as a historical personality. Talking so much about history very much places his own decision-making into the framework of kind of line of Russian history, decades of Russian history, actually. He on numerous occasions said, that American military deployments are now here and there, and these are the cities that our forefathers fought for during the war, and that is absolutely unacceptable. So a lot of very important civilizational, I would say, historical references in that conversation that very much conclude, in his ultimate decision to recognize the two separatist republics as independent. And he also made it clear that it wasn't his primary choice, that Russia basically waited since 2014 when the Maidan protest took place, which Russia sees as a coup in Ukraine. And Russia, I think he quoted literally, did everything to make sure that these republics stay within Ukraine, but the Ukrainian leadership didn't really want to recognize them as belonging to their sovereignty. And finally, I think one of the remarkable things in his speech was that he literally proclaimed Ukraine as illegitimate state. Talking about foreign countries running Ukraine virtually, United States in particular, talking about illegal change of power in that country. And that is also kind of a certain excuse, if not a pretext, to do everything that Russia deems necessary to be done in this situation with it.
Like you said, Dr. Suchkov, that primarily his speech over an hour was addressed at the domestic audience, but there were very interesting comments that he made there that could be seen outside as well. The part where he talks about when he met Bill Clinton and, going back into history and how Russia had asked to join NATO. Now that is also putting it into Russian foreign policy perspective in how NATO and the US and the West did not keep its promises post the dissolution of the Soviet Union, post the collapse of the Berlin Wall, etc.
Yes, frankly, I find that conversation, that part of the Russian discourse, not very helpful in the sense that it doesn't really help the present day situation. Because trying to see any historical reference on whether NATO and Western allies promised anything to Gorbachev, which they did, doesn't really help to solve today's crisis, because it's ultimately all these arguments are used in the Russian debate to show that you cannot really trust the West, which I think most of the Russian public and all of the Russian elites know is the case now anyway. So talking again and again that you can't really trust the West is, I think, it's understandable, but it doesn't really help the situation. What I think is even more important in that reference to Bill Clinton, that that Putin was trying to show that Russia also, since the breakup of the Soviet Union, has pursued some kind of engagement with the West. And when he came to power in late 1990s and early 2000s, one of the ideas that Putin himself played with was, could Russia join NATO? If we're talking about transatlantic security community and Russia was no longer communist, could it be part of that community under the NATO umbrella and have a stake in the Euro-Atlantic security? And basically what he said, that Clinton's response was, at the time, public response was tepid, but the real attitude to that proposal was shown when the United States supported jihadists in the North Caucasus, was Russia fought war in Chechnya, when the United States supported color revolutions in Ukraine and Georgia in the mid-2000s. So basically, he personally concluded, as a politician who was in power for more than 20 plus years, that it doesn't really matter what Russia does or doesn't to satisfy or placate the West, because it will continue to be seen as some alien actor in Eurasia, in Europe, just because it's too big and powerful and too strong and is received suspiciously. So Russia should perhaps stop caring that much about what the West thinks and should just pursue what it really sees its national interests.
Well, interesting that from your last point, let me just take in some viewer questions for you, Dr. Suchkov. Kurt Cobain says, what does Russia stand to gain from it tactically and strategically? Why did President Putin choose to act now when Ukraine's accession into NATO isn't really a possibility in the near future?
This is actually, both are excellent questions. I tend to look at this decision as not in two ways. One, it wasn't the decision to achieve something. As I argued early in one of my pieces, Putin may not necessarily know what he wants, but he knows for sure what he does not want.
Doesn't want.
And he does not exactly want NATO near Russia's borders. He does not want Ukraine in NATO. He does not want missile deployments and other military infrastructure, within minutes of reach of the Russian territory, things like this. So of all the menu of options on the table for him, doing what he did seemed the lesser of the evils, even with greater sanction costs and other things that the West is now threatening Russia with and implementing some. It's still less of a problem for Russia if it didn't really act and allow Ukraine to be NATO. On the second part of the question, indeed, Ukraine was not considered, probably not considered to be in NATO anytime in the nearest future. But what happened and has been happening since 2014, especially, was a growing interoperability between Ukrainian military and the NATO and American forces. Basically, Ukraine was getting integrated into a NATO without formal status in NATO. All the troops were trained by Western instructors. A lot of private military companies operating there, and including fighting in Donbass. At the strategic level, there was this growing interoperability, and the Americans deployed a number of key military infrastructure facilities on the Ukrainian territory that would threaten Russian security. So the idea is, and I think it still is, to push back that military infrastructure further from the Russian borders, and thus, the recognition of Donetsk and Luhansk as independent republics serves in a way as a buffer zone in that, and also pushes even further down the road the issue of Ukrainian NATO accession.
So another question for you, Dr. Suchkov, from Jaydeep Gadavi, who says, what's the thin line between Russia ordering its troops to maintain stability in the Donbass region and Russia not sending its troops to fight? What would the so-called peacekeepers do? And if I can enlarge that to get your response on how Ukraine has reacted to this.
Another excellent question, and I think here the philosophy behind deploying peacekeepers is that while everyone expected a war from Russia, Putin is offering an opportunity for peace. And the peacekeepers, if you look around, and there is obviously a lot of criticism to wherever they are deployed, but if you look around clear-eyed, in the clear-eyed picture, where the Russian military are deployed, peacekeepers are deployed, there is no war, whether it's in Abkhazia or South Ossetia, whether it's Karabakh at this point, whether in Transnistria, they serve as a deterrent for other powers to attack these enclaves. So the idea, I think, the line is indeed very clear. I agree. The key issue here, in my view, is in what borders these new republics should be recognized. And earlier on today, there was interesting controversy between the statements coming from Donetsk and Luhansk and from Moscow. Whereas Lugansk authorities said that they see their own borders as the administrative borders of Lugansk region and Donetsk region. Moscow said they recognize independence of DNR and LNR within the current borders which the authorities of these separatist republics control. So, and these are just a tiny fraction of the entire area that Donetsk and Luhansk. I think I would encourage your listeners and viewers to take a look at the map to see exactly what I'm talking about. So the role for peacekeepers here is to secure this rim of the border and ensure to create this kind of sort of buffer zone between Ukrainian forces and DNR, LNR forces here to ensure that and serve as a deterrent for Ukrainian troops to attack these regions, because if they attack the Russian peacekeepers, then Russia gets a pretext for full deployment, full invasion of its military in Ukraine that Ukrainian authorities say they want to avoid.
So, what about the view that, again, President Putin, like he has in the past, is testing to see the response from the West, from Ukraine, from NATO, but the actual objective is to build a land bridge from the Donbass area to the Crimea, to Krim.
I don't think, well, in a way, it may see from the map that there is a land bridge, even though they don't really, border directly. And like I said, the idea, there is no kind of direct connection, land connection between Crimea and the DNR and LNR. But um, I would say the idea, like I said, and it's also quite interesting, something to watch here. When Russia recognized them as independent republics, and one may get a sense that that means that Minsk Accords as a framework for settling the conflict are dead. But you
Mhm.
hear both European politicians and even Russian ambassador to UN say that the Minsk agreements are not dead. So that raises an interesting question of whether the Russian recognition is kind of an end of the game, or it is supposed to serve as a booster for these agreements to force and compel Ukrainian authorities to comply with their own commitments. And Russia is trying to be kind of an interlocutor between LNR and DNR and Ukraine, which sounds a little crazy at this moment because you can't really be an intermediary when you recognize one party and support it
Mhm.
militarily. So I think at this moment we still have a lot of uncertainty and need to see further steps to figure it out.
Again, another interesting question from Indian Tides, Dr. Suchkov. So, what is the rule-based order if Americans, Chinese, Russians can do whatever they wish to do without any regard for any consequences?
The very phrase, the rules-based order, is exactly the one that Moscow opposed, because this is actually the Western invention to create a club of those who could be trusted and appointed basically by the United States to kind of create legitimacy of actions. Russian actions here do resemble, in some ways, the actions of the U.S. in terms of projecting great power politics here, even though Americans reject that they are doing the realities on the other side of the argument. Uh, but again, I think the idea here is we should create this legal framework for working with the entities that no longer want to stay in Ukraine because Ukrainian forces have been attacking them since 2014, and no international response was able to put pressure on Kyiv to comply with the Minsk agreements. And the Minsk agreements, virtually, they are the model for Ukraine to integrate them back into its state, but to provide security and rights for the Russian-speaking population there, to have a referendum and all kinds of things.
Yeah.
Uh, but it didn't work. So the question Russia is asking: so now that it didn't work and we tried it, what should we wait for anymore? And we should pretty much, if we're talking in kind of Western terms here, use our option of quote unquote responsibility to protect our population in those territories.
Again, we were talking about internal messaging. It was internal, external messaging. What is your take, and how would Russians be seeing, that very interesting conversation that was happening between President Putin and I think it was the FIS head, intelligence chief, who was,
Hmm.
stammering and stuttering, and we have that part of the video as well that we can play out without the audio. I won't play the audio, but if you could explain what is the messaging there?
I have no idea. Has been the greatest. This has been the greatest enigma of yesterday's Security Council, and obviously it's hard to know for sure whether it was staged or this was kind of a bewildered reaction from the intel chief. So I can't really tell you because I have no clue.
Yeah. Again, he talked about sanctions, and President Putin said, no matter what Russia does, the sanctions have been there since 2014 or even before that, and will continue. Latest developments in terms of Nord Stream 2 and Chancellor Scholz stopping the authorization, I think it's some bureaucratic move, but in essence, the response of the West, President Biden citing that presidential order as well. How does the whole sanctions thing sit with Russia and President Putin? Are they
Well, the
discounted? Has
sanctions.
he discounted it completely?
No, I think it's been taken into consideration. And yesterday, that Security Council meeting that we already mentioned a few times, the Prime Minister of Russia said that Russia envisaged that more sanctions could come in any case, whether Russia would invade or not invade. And the government has been preparing the Russian economy for the potential sanctions effect over the last few months. So it also suggests that this option has been, recognizing the separatist republics has been in the minds of the Russian elite for some time. The Nord Stream 2 does seem to be the focal point here because it's a very important project for Russia, obviously, but it's also a very important project for Germany. And Germany would be here. Obviously, Chancellor Scholz is a new guy in the position, and he's under extreme pressure from the Americans. Russia's calculations here is that there will be no great invasion as long as Ukrainian forces do not attack, Donbass, and Russia would have to then respond with greater military force. So as long as everyone kind of accepts the status quo that Putin established yesterday, there is no great invasion. The Germans will not, give up the project because it's ultimately in their own interest. In worst case scenario, if they do, first, they may face a tremendous energy crisis because it's still, even though it's the end of winter in this part of the world, it's still pretty cold, and then there are some reserves, but there is a mid and long-term problem here. Americans who are seeking to bury this project because they want to replace Russian gas with their own LNG in the European market and again, I'm talking about Russia's calculations here, they would not be able to replace the Russian gas exports for at least 2 to 3 years, even if they supply all LNG that they have. That would immediately create a massive crisis in the gas market and increase price of energy all over the world, which is not a bad thing for Russia because obviously Russia can make money off it, but would increase energy prices for American consumers, and that would create a lot of trouble for Biden domestically. So I think for now, Russia has not been panicking that much over what may come next, because it sees that there might be huge shock waves all across the planet, including for the Biden administration.
And again, how do you analyze the Russia-China partnership? You saw what happened when President Putin met President Xi Jinping at the opening ceremony of the Beijing Olympics. The statement in the United Nations Security Council is very short from the Chinese ambassador. But how do you see that developing? Because there's an argument that suggests that because of sanctions, because of how the West is treating Russia, Moscow and Beijing are being pushed closer together towards an alliance.
I think the American actions do push more of Russia into China's hands, which is not necessarily a good thing, but they don't really contribute to a greater Russian-Chinese alliance. The underlying philosophy, in my view, of the Russian-Chinese relations so far could be summed in the phrase that not necessarily together, but never against each other. So I think at this moment, it's more important for Russia that China is not openly against Russia. The Chinese may even vote or abstain, and their votes in the National Security Council, but it's just important that they don't vote together with Americans, which I think will not happen. Russia does not expect any diplomatic or military support from China, and I think the Chinese messaging so far has been clear that they see as not having their own dog in that fight, so that they will not jump to support Russia. But they also would probably, not be against kind of smoldering tensions between America and Russia and Russia and NATO in Europe, because it would keep Americans busy in the European theater and less focused on China. So I think the current conflict is not entirely against China's interests. On one hand, it in some areas makes potentially Russia more dependable on China, U.S. more busy with Russia on that front, and there are some benefits to reap from here. But so far as long as China, is neutral or mildly supportive of Russia's position, I think that's enough for Moscow.
Right. I mean, the focus is not on the Indo-Pacific, many argue, because of that situation. And the similar in the sense that there's a balancing that India has to do between two strategic partners. It has been moving closer to the US and has had a traditional strategic partnership with Russia. We saw what the ambassador had to say in the United Nations Security Council, but that is usually seen as neutral, though it did talk about security concerns, everyone's security concerns. How do you see India in this current situation, Dr. Suchkov?
Well, I totally understand India as one of the emerging great powers, and I tend to look at the role of India in this, in the new grand battle between, the United States and China and Russia here, as a way that Germany's role was during the Cold War between America and Russia, as in the way that as Germany was key to success in the Cold War, because both the Soviet Union and the Americans wanted to have control over Germany, to define the success in the Cold War. The very much the Americans aspired to have greater control over India, because India is key to containing China in the 21st century. So to me, if I could use that metaphor, India is the Germany of the 21st century. But here it also has to navigate extremely carefully, which I think has been the case over the past few years. And right now, India is indeed in difficult position. It doesn't, of course, want to openly support Russian position, and you mentioned the diplomatic statement here. But also, I think what we're seeing now is a huge fight over the principles of the new post-global, kind of post-American world, that Russia is fighting to undermine many of these principles. And I think India may, in a way, find a lot of the things that Russia is doing useful for its own policy, because it does not want the United States to drag it into its military alliance with China, right? India has its own issues with China, but it doesn't necessarily want to jump on board of the US-led military alliance and perhaps pursue a more balanced policy with China, given its geographical proximity and other things. So I think the more wise course that the Indian leadership has been pursuing so far is to keep that balance for as long as possible, and to survive in the new, perhaps non-alignment movement that India has a great experience in.
Strategic autonomy. But just going back to one of the points you had made earlier, Jane Kinninmont has this comment come question. I understand the rule-based international order as a reference to the UN system and international law, not as a US club. You had mentioned it earlier. Does Russia prefer another term? I mean, because when you're looking at, say, India and China, now China has territorial claims, I mean, not just in the South China Sea, but on land in India as well. So, sovereignty and territorial integrity is one of those pillars of the so-called rules-based order. So if you'd like to elaborate on what your earlier comment was.
Yes. This is actually an extremely important question, and because this is in many ways at the center of the kind of philosophical and ideological divisions and disagreements that Russia has with the United States. The Americans are promoting the term, and the West in general, rules-based order. And then Russia, on numerous occasions, have questioned the term and said, we prefer the term international law. Right? If there is international law, this is a clear set of things you should do and shouldn't do. Now, Russia plays international law also on some occasions to its own kind of advantage. But the problem that Russia has with the term rules-based order is who is going to be at the top of that order, and B, who is the one setting those rules. If we're talking about international law, why is it called rules? Because rules supposed to be something different than a set of legal procedures. So the problem that Russia has with this term, rules-based order, is actually this kind of if it's the West who is setting rules, then obviously it won't do the world any good. But also there is one very important kind of theoretical issue, and I know many people in India, perhaps among your audience also, are kind of fans of theory of international relations. If you look into the concept, the rules-based order, this is actually two different categories. The rules is a normative category, and order is a structural category. And there are different actors and different levels operate differently because Americans are not happy with the current order because it no longer benefits just the Americans. The Russians and the Chinese also benefit from it. So the Americans prefer to change rules to make sure that there is a new order where they're still on top. The Chinese prefer to keep the rules because they've learned how to play those rules. But they want to use those rules to ensure that they also emerge on top and kind of sideline the United States. Russia's economic potential is not at the level to compete at that level with the United States and China, but it still has massive military power that it sees to stick to these categories.
In that sense, would you say that one of the objectives of Russia and President Putin has been achieved in terms of Russia is dealing with the US on a one-to-one basis in terms of power projection, and also I just wanted to get another interesting question that comes from Madhu Ramaswamy. Is there any opposition to what President Putin is doing internally? He asks, in fact, what is the stance of Alexei Navalny's party on the crisis?
I have no idea I have no idea what. Well, first of all, there's no party in the political sense. Navalny supporters, of course, I would say in the Western informational bubble, while Russia in its own informational bubble. They obviously support the talking points of the Western pundits and media, and they think that Putin is doing tremendous harm to Russia with these decisions. They think that Putin's gone crazy, his decisions are not rational, they go against Russia's interests. Obviously, the Putin supporters and very much in line with the president, but there hasn't been any surveys done, except for some time ago there was a survey that people thought that the Americans, about 50% of the population thought the Americans are the ones to blame for the crisis. 14% of the people thought that Ukraine was to blame for the crisis, and 5% of people thought Putin was to blame for the crisis. But it was before all the decisions that were yesterday. We'll see.
Right. And a very short last question in terms of, do you see the doors of diplomacy still open? I mean, there was talk about Blinken and Lavrov meeting. The summit is still up in the air. Biden, Putin, of course.
Well, sure. I think any resorts and any means that could be used to stop a war are necessary, and any engagement is necessary at this point. The decision that was made yesterday is irreversible. This, I think, was Russia's idea how to freeze the conflict that has been going on since 2014. And the developments were shifting not in Russia's favor, but Russia is still there. Russia is the most powerful military actor in that part of the world. And the movements of Western powers suggest, actually, including that they moved their embassies to western part of Ukraine. Many people here thought it resembles the withdrawal from Afghanistan, where the Western embassies had to flee Kabul. Now that they don't flee the country, but they move their embassies to West, that suggests the West is not willing to go into further military confrontation with Russia. So I think now actually there's a window of diplomatic opportunity, but we'll see how things play out in the next couple of days, because how Ukraine responds, whether the military option would be invoked, and these are all important triggers for how the conflict may develop into what trajectory it may develop.
Dr. Suchkov, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on StratNews Global again with your perspective and expertise. And it shows in terms of lots of questions which I couldn't take and lots of viewers. So India may be really far from the epicenter of what's happening in Europe, but
maybe for the best. Maybe for the best. Thanks so much for having me. Always a pleasure.
This is The Gist on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh, Revi.